Hi, welcome to the third lecture of week 5 in the Sociology of Work and Technology, where we're going to talk about contemporary issues facing workers. This last lecture of week 5 is intended to give a preview for the second half of the course. Now that you have sufficient background on technology's role in the workplaces of the 19th and 20th centuries, as well as an understanding of basic capitalist techniques for organizing work, I think we're ready to move into discussions of contemporary issues. To do so, we need to understand what's been going on for the past several decades in terms of the global labor market. First, there's been a shift to knowledge or creative work. We talked about this a little bit early on in the course when I spoke of the shift to the tertiary sector or the service economy. Now, you might remember that services in that context included both creative jobs and knowledge work, so researchers, being a professor, doing design work, even film or cultural production, social media workers. Those are all part of the service economy just as much as, people working at a restaurant or working in hospitality. Now, the textbook chapter I assigned this week goes a bit further to explain how this shift is, 1, bound up in processes of globalization, and 2, bound up in new technologies that enable new modes of work and working. This is what we're going to examine in the second half of this course. Now, when we talk about these processes of globalization and these new forms of work that are enabled by technology, I think many of us tend to have a rather rosy-eyed techno-utopian point of view. And I think, some of you all have made these sorts of statements in your reading response papers every week. You've said things like, but we're all so technological now. It's not like what Weber or Taylor described. Or you said things like, but technology is making work better and more efficient. In the textbook, we see quite the opposite. And throughout the remainder of the course, you're going to be presented with empirical evidence to the contrary of this techno-utopian view that many of you espouse. Rather than emancipating us from work or liberating us from tedium, technologies afford the possibility of round-the-clock working in ever more tightly tailorized workplaces. This is evident in Amazon's warehouses and the delivery drivers that they used, just as much as among so-called creative workers who labor in what are sometimes called content mills, pumping out videos and news articles for the insatiable appetites of consumers locked down during the pandemic. So how did we get here? Well, first, in the early 20th century, we had what was called the managerial revolution, wherein we saw the rise of large-scale bureaucratic organizations run by complex hierarchies of managers and supervisors, rather than by direct oversight of a single boss or boss's family. Many social scientists and other observers speculated that this managerial revolution might bring beneficial change to workers, as managers might act with benevolence towards workers, rather than solely focusing on profits. This, as you'll see in the reading, did not occur. Instead, we've seen the rise of what is called neoliberalism, and the separate but related phenomenon of globalization. Let's start with neoliberalism. First, the liberalism in neoliberalism refers to economic liberalism. This is an economic philosophy most closely associated with Adam Smith. You'll remember that I said that Smith believed strongly in the power of the market to benefit society, believed strongly that competition would solve all social problems, and believed strongly that productivity for business owners would result in a better society overall. Milton Friedman, a U.S. economist of the so-called Chicago School, brought Smith into the 20th century. Friedman and his colleagues claim that removing state regulation and having the state retreat from intervening in the market or social life would result in the greatest good for society overall. This idea became part of political policy in many countries around the world and was enacted by people like Ronald Reagan in the United States, Margaret Thatcher in the UK, and Brian Mulroney in Canada. All three agreed with Friedman that the economy would become more productive and competitive with less state regulation and less state intervention in the economy. As is said in the assigned text this week, public policy was guided by the assumption that free markets can best determine who benefits and who loses from economic restructuring. The ideas of Adam Smith were used to justify the inevitable increases in inequality. High unemployment came to be viewed as normal. In some jurisdictions, labor rights were diluted. Social programs of the welfare state came to be seen as a hindrance to balanced budgets and economic competitiveness. And government-run services were privatized, changes that directly or indirectly affected employment. Since then, of course, we've seen broad elimination of labor protections worldwide, scaling back of social support, or what is called the welfare state, a global race to the bottom in terms of wages, with manufacturing companies fleeing countries like Canada and the US to China and South Asia and other low-wage nations. We've seen heightened unemployment with fewer and fewer government benefits, environmental devastation, and now a global pandemic in which hardly any country takes care of its citizens in terms of economic and social benefits. Even though Canada ranks quite well in terms of inequality when taken into consideration, globally, it's something that's shown in the charts that are in the assigned chapter, the country still suffers from many of these problems created by neoliberal policies. Along with deregulation and the general retreat of the state from social life, neoliberalism also saw the opening of economic borders through various free trade agreements, such as NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is now called USMCA, or US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which is a somewhat kind of clumsy name, which makes sense. I mean, the U.S. Trump administration produced it. Not exactly the best and brightest. Anyway, these agreements form part of what we commonly call globalization, in which labor, capital, or money, products, and information move easily across borders and around the world. Now, for the context of this class, we're going to focus on labor. These free trade agreements create labor mobility, with many workers migrating across borders for work. Canadians, for example, working in northern U.S. cities, and Americans like myself working in Canada through fairly easy to obtain temporary work permits to fill positions when needed. Likewise, the U.S. has many workers from Mexico under similar work permits. With that said, many of the jobs opened up by these free trade agreements are in low-paying, ultimately precarious forms of work, such as fast food services, cooking, cleaning, healthcare, and agricultural work. So while labor may have gained some mobility, it seems as if these free trade agreements allow people to take advantage of non-resident foreign workers' willingness to work for less than citizens. And that happens. It's been in the news in the pandemic. There's been a lot of issues with undocumented agricultural workers and their exploitation. So, you can just look through the archives of the CBC for that sort of information. So with all this in mind, we're going to be moving on to discuss work in these globalized, networked contexts. How is it that managers of capitalist organizations maintain control over workers across vast distances and temporalities? How is it that organizations manage or control what is called creative work, where employees expect to be autonomous, to be creative? How is that managed? How is it that businesses increasingly encourage workers to work harder, but for less economic certainty? The answer to all of these questions is, you guessed it, digital technologies and new modes or techniques for organizing work. So I'll see you after the break when we'll start learning about the pleasures and perils of networked and algocratic organizations. See you then. Enjoy your break.